All right, it's time to put it all together. In the previous screencast, we built a backend that allowed us to create and read and delete specific to-dos. What I have in the background is simply just this server that's starting on 3001, and I've gone back and started our server on localhost 3000. This is where we left off on the front end. What we need to do now is, instead of storing to-dos in memory, we need to connect our front-end application to our back-end application. And in order to do that, we need to make some AJAX requests from localhost 3000 to localhost 3001. This means that we're going to need to run some asynchronous code. What's really important to understand is that Redux does not have any built-in support for our actions to be asynchronous. Our actions are always objects. Well, that's a little bit of a gotcha. There is a way to dispatch asynchronous actions, but to do that, we need to introduce a little bit of Redux middleware. The tool that we're going to be using is called Redux Thunk. So we are going to npm install Redux Thunk. And this allows us to very easily create asynchronous actions. We can go take a look at Redux Thunk, because you might be hearing this word thunk and wondering just what the idea is here. What's really nice with Redux Thunk is the documentation is quite good. So we can see what is a thunk. A thunk is a function that wraps an expression to delay its evaluation. What we're going to do here is wait until an AJAX call has finished to then dispatch an action. As opposed to just dispatching right away, we're going to simply wait until an asynchronous action has finished, in our case, an AJAX call. And when it's done, we're then going to dispatch some kind of action. So we're going to have to make some separate functions that are asynchronous to handle these operations. To get started, we simply have to install Redux Thunk. npm install Redux Thunk. So back over here, we've installed Redux Thunk, and I'm going to open this up in Sublime. Inside of Sublime, we need to first start in our index.js. The first thing we want to do is import Thunk from Redux Thunk. The main idea here is that Redux Thunk allows us to write action creators that return a function instead of an action. The thunk in this case delays dispatch so that we can wait until some asynchronous action has completed to then dispatch an action. We previously saw that action creators are just simple functions that return an object or some kind of action. But what we're going to do is use Redux Thunk so that we can instead return a function which delays the dispatch of some action. It's a little bit tricky to wrap your head around, but we'll see this in code and it should make a little bit more sense. So we're going to import Thunk, and then we're going to tell our store about that middleware. In order to do that, we need to bring in a couple more things from Redux. We're going to bring in apply middleware, and we're going to bring in compose. And apply middleware is going to allow us to use Redux middleware, specifically Thunk. The second parameter to create store is a combination of middleware that we're using. So we are going to use the compose function to bring that all together. The first thing that we want to pass in to compose is apply middleware. And apply middleware is a function that accepts some kind of middleware, in our case, Thunk. We're going to save this, and that way when we create our store, we're going to use the root reducer, and then we're going to compose all the middleware together into one function. We're going to use the Redux dev tools, and we're going to use Redux Thunk. And that's really all we need to do inside of our index.js. The rest of the work actually happens inside of our action creators, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky. What we're going to do is export some asynchronous functions. We're going to start by not exporting these action creators. These action creators right here are going to be very simple. We're actually going to rename them. Let's call this one handle add. That's going to take some kind of task. We'll call this handle remove. And then we're going to make one more for actually getting all of our to-dos. We'll call that handle to-dos. And this will dispatch an action with a type of GetToDues and some kind of data that we get back from our backend. And if we want to do that, we have to make sure we also make a new action type for GetToDues. This right here will retrieve all the to-dos. This will remove a single one, and this will add a single one. But you might be wondering, well, how are we going to use these action creators? Well, these are not actually the functions that we're going to export. The functions that we're going to export are going to use Redux Thunk. So let's see how that works. we're going to start by exporting a function called GetToDues. And this is going to accept no parameters yet, but instead of returning an object, it's going to return a function. This function is going to accept a parameter called dispatch. You'll see this syntax a little bit less frequently. So we're going to use ES 2015 arrow functions. And this is what it looks like. Inside of here, we are going to run some kind of AJAX call. So we're going to use fetch. And we are going to fetch http://localhost/API/todos. And once we're done with this AJAX call, we're going to run .then. And we're going to get back some response and convert that to JSON. What we're going to do with the next piece of data that's been converted to JSON is dispatch a function. We're going to dispatch handle_todos. And handle_todos accepts some information. And if anything goes wrong, it would be really good to have a nice way to handle errors, but all I want to do here is console.log something went wrong and pass in that error. Here we should really be dispatching something, but I'm going to keep it real simple just for some error handling right now. So what did we just do here? We made a function that is an action creator, except we thought that action creators normally return objects. But what is this one returning? It's returning a function. And this function will execute an asynchronous action. And once that asynchronous action is completed, we'll dispatch an action creator, the ones that we're used to, that just return an object. So this is what it would look like to get to-dos. Let's add a couple other for adding to-dos and for removing. So we're going to export a function, and we'll call this AddToDo. This is going to take in some kind of task. We're going to use these functions inside of our React components. That's what we're going to connect Redux with React. So we're going to once again return dispatch. And inside of here, we're going to return the result of fetch. But where are we going now? Well, same place, HTTP localhost, and it looks like I forgot the port number here. That's 3001. Localhost 3001/API/todos. But here we have to pass in a bit more information. We want a method of post. We want to pass in the correct headers. So we'll use some new headers. And inside of here, we want to make sure that we pass in a header of content type and a value of application/JSON. I'm using fetch here, but if you want to keep it simpler, you could use Axios, but you should see how fetch works. And then we want to make sure that we pass in some kind of body. So we're going to stringify an object with a key of task and a value of task. This is what we're going to be sending to the server. And when this is all done, we're going to get back some data that we're going to convert to JSON. And when that has finished, we're going to dispatch an action. So we're going to get some data back, and we are going to dispatch the handle add action. This handle add action is very simple. It's going to go right to our reducer. It's going to trigger AddToDo with whatever task we pass in. Well, in this case, we might not want to call that task. We might want to call that something like to do. So we'll save that. And right here, we're going to pass in very simply whatever we've gotten from our server, that data right here. If anything goes wrong, we'll simply just console.log something went wrong, and we'll get that error. So what we're doing here is in our React component, when a to-do is added, we're going to wait until an AJAX call has finished. When that AJAX call has finished, we're going to go to our reducer with that new to-do that we made, that we got back from the server. And then we're going to go back to map state to props, and we're going to update our React component. So once again, we'll set a couple breakpoints to see how this all works. But let's write one more function called remove to do. This is going to accept some kind of ID. And once again, this is an asynchronous action because removing a to-do requires going to the backend and returning the result of some AJAX call. So once again, we want to go actually use template strings here because we're going to go to localhost 3000/API/todos, and we're going to get whatever that ID is. Once again, what method do we want here? We want to specify the HTTP verb of delete. And when that's done, just like we saw before, we're going to get back some response, convert that to JSON. And then we're going to get back some data, and we'll dispatch the result of the handle remove function with the ID passed to it. And I'll just grab this last error handle right here. What we've done here is created 3 action creators that don't return objects, they return functions. And what's going to happen is we're going to use AddToDo, remove to do, and GetToDues inside of our React component. And when our React component triggers these functions, we're going to run these asynchronous calls, and then we're going to dispatch our good old action creators. Remember, here is where we're actually going to return information that go to our reducer. So let's go to our root reducer for a second. Inside of our root reducer, things look a little bit different. We're not going to need an ID of 0 because Mongoose is going to keep track of IDs. We also want to make sure we bring in GetToDues. Our initial state is going to start as an empty array because we're not going to go make an AJAX request from our reducer. We'll see how to get that started in a bit. What we're going to first make sure we have is an action type for GetToDues. And when that happens, we're simply going to return whatever we had in state along with todos, which comes in as action.what. Well, remember, what we pass in inside of our action creators for GetToDues is some kind of data. So we'll do action.data. That looks good. What's the next thing we want to think about? When we add a to-do, we don't really have to worry about incrementing IDs or anything like that. So we're just going to do something very similar. We're going to return whatever was in state, and our to-dos will be whatever we had before, along with what we got back from that specific to-do. This right here, action.todo. For remove to-do, things are going to be very similar, except we want to be a little bit careful. With Mongo, we get an ID that comes in as underscore ID. So we'll want to make sure that we save that right there. So right now, our reducer is going to have the ability to get to-dos, to add to-dos, and remove to-dos. But when do we actually start using these specific functions? Well, all the fun begins in our to-do list.js. What we want to do right off the bat is make sure that we get our second function, GetToDues, from here. Remember, these right here all are thunks. If we take a quick look side by side with our action creators, we can see these functions right over here. Let's go look at our to-do list, add to-do, remove to-do, and GetToDues. These are all our thunks. These are all asynchronous operations right now that at the end of the day dispatch an action to take us to the reducer. So what we're going to make sure that we do in our to-do list as well is make sure that we bring in GetToDues on props. Now what we want to think about is when this component loads, we want to go to the database and get all of our to-dos. So we're going to add the lifecycle method of component did mount. And when this happens, we are going to run this.props.getToDues. And you might be wondering, well, what about the .then? What about all the asynchronous operation? Well, we don't have to do that here because when we run GetToDues, we're going to go to our action creator. We're going to run GetToDues. We're going to make an AJAX request, and then we're going to dispatch handle to-dos with whatever data we got back. Inside of our to-do list, we also want to make sure that we fix a couple things. Remember, everything is coming in as underscore ID, and our key can be that specific ID. We don't have to worry about an index anymore since we're using Mongo for our database. So let's save this now, and let's go see what's happening in the browser. We're going to go start the server up and see how many bugs we've made. Let's go start this. We'll give that a second. And let's see if everything's working as planned or if there's some things that we forgot about. What you want to make sure that you have with asynchronous actions is just the ability to dispatch thunks. Oop, looks like I got a little syntax error in ActionCreators.js 46. So let's head over to ActionCreators 46. Don't ever want a semicolon. Always want to make sure we chain this with a dot. Let's go save that. All right, looks like we're running something. Let's go refresh this right here. And what's interesting to note is code. Well, where did that come from? Remember in the last video on the back end, we actually made this right here. So what I'm going to do is log my XML HTTP requests, and I'm going to refresh the page. And when the page loads, it finishes loading this right here, localhost 3001/todos. If I look at the response, well, that's just the information right there on the page. But this right here is the API call that we make to get back all of those to-dos. Well, what about adding a to-do? Let's try that out. Always keep our Chrome DevTools open. Let's try to add a to-do. Shouldn't be called add a to-dos, but we can fix that. So let's fix a typo. Let's go add that to-do. And notice here that fetched finish loading options. If you remember how CORS works, we send a very quick request to make sure that we can actually make a CORS request to that domain. Otherwise, we'll get an issue with the same origin policy. And inside of ActionCreators 37, this is the actual AJAX request that's being made. If I refresh the page, we can see right here that this is still being persisted. We're using a database for all of this information. So what I'll do right now is remove one of these, and it looks like we've removed it successfully. When I refresh the page, I still have fix a typo. So let's add a to-do, and we'll say, go over all this code. And we'll add that to-do. And notice here, we made that AJAX request to get that information. If we take a look on the back end, we can actually see all these requests that are coming in. All these options, or what we call pre-flight requests, to make sure that they're authorized. And then we've deleted as well, and getting one more time. We're inserting, we're finding and modifying. This is exactly what we want to do to wire everything back up. Now, there's a lot of code that we've written, so let's go take a step back and see how we put it all together. When you start working with a backend, you need to communicate to that backend. We got to use AJAX. And when you're using AJAX, you're dealing with asynchronous code. And in the confines of Redux, we can't actually write action creators that are not synchronous. Redux only supports action creators that are synchronous out of the box. In order to allow for asynchronous action creators, or in order to allow an action creator to not return an object but a function, we need to use Redux Thunk. We need to delay the evaluation of some expression. In this case, delaying the dispatch. We're going to wait until a function finishes before we dispatch. What I'll do next is set some breakpoints, but I want to walk through the code first. In our index.js, we import Thunk, and we compose all of our middleware. That includes the Redux DevTools. Notice here we're still using React Router. We've wrapped everything all together. Inside of my root reducer, I've changed things around a little bit. I don't have to worry about keeping track of some ID because the backend's going to do that. And I don't have to worry about adding to-dos by managing IDs or anything. All I do is grab whatever comes in from that action. So we'll start here by putting a debugger inside of the root reducer. The next thing I do in my to-do list, and let's close this for a second so that I don't get too many debuggers. Inside of the to-do list, we're going to start by grabbing some Redux state. So I'll throw a debugger right here. We're then going to render some information. I'll throw a debugger right here. And let's go see how information flows throughout our application. Inside of my action creators, I'll do the same exact thing. For each one of these, I'll go put a debugger, so we can see exactly how everything flows in our application. It's going to be a lot of debuggers, but if you can understand how data flows in an application with Redux, you're in great shape. So let's go back and let's go to localhost 3000. I'm going to keep my DevTools open, and we're going to start by refreshing the page. Now, the first place we go to is always the root reducer. No asynchronous actions have happened yet. Redux always has to dispatch this @init. Where do we go next? We always go back to map state to props. Our initial state doesn't have the to-dos from the backend yet. What we want to do first is render the component, and then when that component mounts, we're going to trigger GetToDues. And GetToDues is going to run this asynchronous operation. And when this asynchronous operation is done, we are going to dispatch handle_todos. And when we dispatch handle_todos, notice we get back this data right here. And this data refers to what we're getting back from the backend. What we're going to do then is dispatch an action of GetToDues. That's going to take us back to the reducer, and it's going to go put us right back here in this return statement. And once we return this information, where do we go? Well, it's the same old cycle as before. Back into map state.props with the new data, back into render, and then we render components on the page. A lot of fun stuff. Let's do it again. Refresh the page. The first place we go to, as always, is the reducer. We need some initial state. None of these action types are going to be triggered, so we're going to default to our original state. We're then going to go back to map state to props, as we always do, with some default state, which is an array with nothing in it. We're then going to go back to render, and when we render, we're going to immediately trigger component did mount. When component did mount runs, this is a React lifecycle method, it's going to trigger this.props.getToDues. Well, what is getToDues? It is an action creator that returns a function. It is a thunk. And when this action creator finishes an asynchronous action, it's going to dispatch a function called handle_todos. Remember, whenever we dispatch, we always return an object. And what are we returning here? An object with the type of GetToDues. The second that we dispatch, where do we go? We always go back to the root reducer. It all builds upon itself. Except this time, we have GetToDues, which is going to take whatever was in state and the to-dos that we got back from the API. We're going to go back to map state to props. We're going to render the component again with our to-dos. All right, let's do it again. How about adding a to-do? When I click add a to-do, we're going to render again because of the React router. When I type in the task of awesome, let's add that to-do. When I add that to-do, we go run this AddToDo function. This is going to dispatch an action. It's going to dispatch the action that allows me to handle add. And notice those additional debuggers because the React router is changing the page. So inside a handle add, I get back that new to-do that I made. This is what my backend is responding with. I go back to the root reducer. I go back to AddToDo, and all over again, map state to props, render the component, and here we go. We have that new one right there. How about deleting? When I delete, I go to remove to do and I get the ID. How am I getting that ID? Well, remember, I've binded that correctly in my React component. Inside of here, I've binded or bound the correct ID. We then go back to handle remove. When that's done, we go back to our root reducer. And finally, we're going to hit remove to do. We're going to go back to map state to props. We're going to render the component again, and we're going to see it without that specific to do. So this is how we can put everything together. There are a lot of moving parts, but the more that you can set debuggers and step through each part of the application, the more you're going to understand how it works. The most important thing to understand about what we've done so far is that by default, Redux does not allow action creators to return anything that's not an object. We always have to dispatch objects. But when we use Redux Thunk, our action creators can return functions because we want a function to delay the execution of dispatching. We don't want to dispatch right away. We want to wait until an asynchronous operation has finished, and then we can dispatch that same old object that we're used to every time. So when you need Redux to run some kind of asynchronous operation, you have to make sure to use some kind of middleware. Redux Thunk is a very popular one. Redux Saga is another one as well. So we'll stop here. Take a look at this code, write it yourself, set some debuggers, step through, and you'll master how data flows through a full stack application with React, Redux, a Node backend, and the React router. I'll see you in the next screencast.